Yeah,
and
please,
then
yeah.
we'll get cracking. So welcome everybody to our 191st Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar. Reminded this just now that it is almost 5 years since we started doing this back in those dark days of the pandemic. And it's obviously continued to provide a source of well, a place where we can present work, meet people, network, see what's going on in the area of sport and economics, or sports economics. Today we have Scott Baker presenting Gambling Away Stability, Sport Betting's Impact on Vulnerable Households. Before he starts, I just want to emphasize that in the reminder notice that you got this morning, there's a list of various dates, of course, forthcoming talks in the series. So next week we'll have Tazio Panzani from the University of Perugia presenting, but then also the day after, so a week on Saturday, March the 1st, is the deadline for the second Latin American Sports Economics Conference in Lima, Peru. I'll put the website in the chat, and you'll have seen a reference to it if you happen to be in the WhatsApp group for the Roses seminars. And if you want to be in that WhatsApp group, let me know, send me your phone number. But if you do want to attend the second Latin American Sports Economics Conference, where the keynote speakers are David Forrest, who is here with us today, and Stefan Szymanski, who may well be with us today, a regular visitor, or regular attendee and presenter in this series. So please do consider submitting your paper for the second Latin American Sports Economics Conference. March the 10th, a little bit further on, there's also a deadline for the 9th Athens University of Economics and Business Sports Analytics Workshop in Athens in May. Always a nice excuse to get to somewhere like Athens in Greece when the weather isn't so great. So please do look out for that. Without any further delay, Scott, you've got best part of an hour and a half. Please do use it as you see fit. Are you happy to take questions as you go along, or would you prefer to have a
No,
please
ask questions during that. That always feels like I'm talking to myself. So yeah.
Okay, well, the floor is yours, the virtual floor.
All right. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. So this paper is joint with a number of folks from Kansas and Brigham Young universities, and the idea was just to kind of study some of the impacts that sports betting has had, sports betting legalization in the U.S. On kind of household finance and household consumption. Most of my own work kind of over the past decade or so has revolved around kind of household finances and consumption, and kind of studying different shocks to household and how these kind of percolate through household financial decision making, be it consumption or investment or other things like that, how they interact with government programs and things. And so this like staggered rollout of legalization across U.S. states, provides a kind of a nice setting, or at least potentially some nice identification for understanding how legalization is going to affect household finances in general, and has the potential to be quite large. So this is now legal in 38 states and Washington, D.C. and counting. Probably going to hit at least 40 or 42 states this year. There might be a few holdouts by the end of the year, but it pretty much seems likely that in some form or another, sports betting is going to be legal across the country within the next couple of years. And we're talking about sizable amounts of money as well. So this data just went up to 2023. This is just taken from an article looking at kind of the aggregate amount being bet. So for all of 2023, we're talking about $120 billion or so. 2024 saw about a 25% increase in that to over $160 billion. And you can think about, as many of you probably know, maybe about 10% of that or so of gross bets flows through to the gambling company. So you can think about their revenue, the gambling company's income or losses from consumers, from bettors, are going to be about 10% of gross wagers. That's smaller for some types of bets, larger for other types of bets, but about 10% overall. So This is still growing massively as more states legalize, but also kind of on the intensive margin as more people within a state take it up and as more people who already are betting bet more. But we're already talking about 10-20 billion dollars of losses, and probably going to be approaching $50 billion of losses in the next in the next few years. So we want to understand, partly just from an accounting standpoint, where is that money coming from, right? There are a lot of discussions by the sports betting companies that very much pitch sports gambling as just entertainment, right? So if this is just a substitution away from going to the movies or going out to the bar one more time a week, and instead we put down $20 on a football game and lose, maybe there's no kind of spillover to the rest of the household budget or household finances. This is certainly the kind of view that most of these companies take. If you go and look at their websites and think about, they all have lots of stuff about responsible gambling. This is entertainment. Don't chase losses. Set dollar limits. Do all these things. Be cautious. If you are kind of have addictive personalities, limit yourself and just think of this as an entertainment expense. But I think there are some other reasons to believe that it might not just be substituting for other entertainment spending. So this is some stuff we've seen, and this is just kind of a selection of comments from the sports betting subreddit. But you see similar sorts of comments wherever people are talking about sports betting. Is very common among younger individuals, especially where there's this conflation of sports betting and stock trading, and sports betting and other forms of investment in general. And there's this really common sort of belief that sports betting is maybe not worse than stock trading. If anything, maybe stock trading is more akin to gambling, and sports betting is wagering on something that's kind of real and not as manipulable. And stock trading, so one of these people here says, look at GameStop, for example, right? There's no reason it should have been, pumped up, years ago like it was. Maybe stock trading is just gambling anyway, and sports betting is gambling on something that I kind of understand and that I know. I like sports betting better because it's cash instantly. It's easier to understand. And one of my favorite quotes I've ever read about this is, Warren Buffett said to invest in something that you're passionate about, and I'm passionate about sports. And so, obviously Warren Buffett approves of this guy, sports betting. So, we wanted to, and it's hard. This is an empirical question. Where is this money that is flowing into these gambling sites going, and where is it coming from in the rest of the household budget? What we're going to do in this paper, and I'll kind of walk you through the data a little bit and then through the empirics, is basically to use really detailed bank and credit card transaction data from several 100,000 households from 2012 or so kind of far before these legalizations started, up until mid 2023, and we're getting some updated data so we can kind of push this to 2025. And we're going to use that data to directly observe transactions from household bank accounts to these sports betting sites. But then we can also observe kind of all of their other consumption transactions, their spending, both the inflows for income as well as the outflows to other sorts of investments and consumption. And we're going to use this to kind of characterize and document where that money is coming from. So we're going to talk a little bit first about the characteristics of sports bettors, say, versus non-bettors, or sports bettors of different levels of intensity of sports betting. We're going to find that betting crowds in rather than crowding out other sorts of entertainment spending. So instead of substituting for entertainment spending, it actually induces additional entertainment spending, the legalization. And partly because of that, it puts pressure on the rest of household budgets. And so overall, we find about $1 of betting leads to about a $1 of reduction in financial investments. These effects are larger for financially constrained households. And we find some evidence that households kind of tend to go and run up credit card balances and more frequently overdraw checking accounts in the wake of these sports betting legalization. All right. So the data provider that we're going to be using here is a large kind of fintech aggregation firm. So this is a sort of data that I've used in a lot of papers in the past to kind of understand both a lot of granular information about a given household, but also across tens or hundreds of thousands or even millions of households across the US. So this provider basically contracts with banks and fintech companies to get all of their data anonymized, but linked to individuals. And they go and sell that information mostly to like hedge funds who can go and trade on consumption transactions and things like that. But they also get to sell to academics, so we can kind of understand household behavior. But this is nice because it avoids active selection at a user level into the data. All the selection is kind of at a financial transaction, at a financial institution level. And we do a lot of work in the paper and in other papers that I've done to try to show that this is like a pretty representative group. We try to limit the households that we're looking at to those that we think we have a very complete picture of. And so we kind of understand all of their inflows and outflows in general. We see overall bank and credit card transactions for about 60 million households. We're going to be using a small sample of that, mostly just for ease of use on our side. And we're going to have coverage for about 10 years of data. And so for each of these transactions, and you can think of this as basically a view into people's bank accounts and credit card accounts, where for every individual transaction, you can see the merchant that's going to, you can see the date and the amount, you can see the category that merchant represents, and also where that transaction occurred kind of physically or if it was online. And so by that, we can identify where people live, which is going to allow us to place people into states that are legal or illegal to gamble. We are going to look broadly across consumption and income categories, but we're also going to go in and pick out particular transactions to focus on, which are these transactions, deposits or withdrawals from these betting sites. So the two largest in the US are FanDuel and DraftKings. There's a lot of others as well that we can observe. So Bet365, BetMGM, Barstool Sportsbook, Betfair, PointsBet. There's kind of a long tail of these, but the vast majority of them are two are about 70%, and about 5 are about 90% of sports betting in the US. We're going to use the descriptions of the transactions to identify some of the other spending patterns as well. So things like investments, or we're going to try to dig in and look at other sorts of gambling activity that we can observe from this data as well. And then I'll also talk a little bit about changes in consumption that are at like a broad categorical level, not at a particular merchant, but entertainment versus restaurants versus general merchandise spending we can observe. All right. And yeah, stop me if there's any questions on the data or kind of setup so far. A few things that we can do just to compare kind of bettors versus non-bettors in our sample. We look at a few sorts of financial comparisons. For one, we see that bettors have about the same level of income, approximately the same levels of flows to investments, about the same levels of debt as non-bettors do. So they don't look too dramatically different in terms of observable financial characteristics. But there are some big differences in kind of other sorts of risk-seeking behavior or risky behavior. So people who we observe gambling on sports are much more likely to have also been observed to gamble via like a online poker or a state-level lotteries, or to buy cryptocurrency, for instance. This is still a minority of gamblers. So you can see, only a few % of people played online poker here, even if you were a sports bettor, but that's, 5 times more than the non-betting population, and kind of similar proportions for lottery. Crypto is a bit more common and is much more common among the sports bettors. So, in general, the sports bettors are the people who you might think, the people who are enjoying risky behavior and gambling, not just on sports, but kind of on other things as well. We also kind of point out, so unfortunately we can't see a lot of demographics. We can't see age or gender in our data. They're all kind of anonymized. We see complete financial pictures, but we can't see anything in detail about demographics. But one thing that we can note is that there's this child tax credit that was expanded child tax credit that was passed during the pandemic. And we actually see a bigger proportion of bettors receive this than non-bettors. And we point to that to say, this is not just all like 19-year-old college students with no kids. There's a lot of people who are kind of adults with dependents who are engaging in sports betting in general. All right. The other thing to note, and I think this kind of established, by some survey evidence as well, but we can certainly back that survey evidence up with kind of actual empirics here and actual observable financial data, is that there is a massive skew in the kind of amount that's being bet across the bettors. So, in this table, we were just splitting people into like have ever done sports betting or have not done sports betting, kind of a binary 0-1 indicator. Here we're splitting up the people who are sports bettors into terciles of how much they've bet. And you can see that there's this massive skew, right? Where the lowest tercile is on average bets about $1.50 per quarter, right? So maybe they put in $10 once and then never again for the next 4 years. The second tercile is more like up to almost $10 per quarter, but then the third tercile kind of explodes upwards and is like $300 a quarter, right? And so this is this massive, if you're talking about the aggregate amount of money being bet and kind of where most of our results are going to be coming from, it's not the people who, bet $10 once, it's the people who are betting very heavily and depositing very heavily kind of over and over again and kind of racking up sizable amounts. So overall, and these aren't one-to-one, the total bets to average bets is not one-to-one because these places were legal for different amounts of time. And so you had different amounts of quarters where you were kind of able to bet. But up in the third tercile, these people are betting multiple thousands. And this is deposits, right? This is deposit flows from their account to these sports books, almost $7,000 in total. And this is just growing over time. As there more time passes since legalization, that third tercile keeps kind of separating from the pack. If you think about this relative to their income, it's pretty sizable, right? Almost 2% of their income is flowing into these sports books, right? All right. We also see that deposits are kind of similarly skewed, so not just in amounts, but kind of the number of deposits that people do. So about 70% of people are depositing 3 or more times. About 40% of depositors, if you've ever deposited, that you deposit 10 or more separate times. About 40% of people who we observe depositing to one also have deposited to multiple sites. So that would be like I have an account with FanDuel and with DraftKings, and with Bet365. So people are there's kind of a skew in amounts, in number of deposits, and also there's kind of a tail of people with just lots of accounts across these different sites. And we also see that this isn't just a flash in the pan for most people. So for a lot of these people who bet, they tend to kind of continue to bet fairly regularly over time, deposit fairly regularly over time. So this is looking kind of conditional on betting at quarter 0. This is when they do their first sports bet. It's 100% probability that they make a deposit by definition, kind of mechanically. And then looking every quarter since then, they tend to have about a 50 to 60% probability of having another deposit in that next quarter. Okay. And so this attrits a bit, this decreases a bit, but it's fairly flat. And so a lot of these people are very consistently depositing money, continuing to deposit more and more money into these sports books. If you're still active after a few years, typically you've deposited about 10 times what your initial deposit was. Okay, so kind of the longer that this legalization lasts, the longer that these people kind of stay connected to these sports books in general, the more likely it is that they're going to have kind of continued deposits and continued losses over time. All right. We were kind of interested a little bit at some of the more constrained households, and we can measure. I'll say constrained several times in this presentation, and we can measure this in different ways by looking at like the level of savings that these people have. We can look at their account balances. We can look at their flows of savings over the past year, so kind of a more dynamic view. We can look for like people who have overdrafted their account or not, and say that they're a little more constrained or a little more vulnerable kind of financially. But whatever mechanism you want to say, there's a lot of correlation between these things. And overall, we find that typically the lower income, lower levels of savings people tend to bet a little bit less. They have lower income, but they tend to bet a much larger fraction of their income. So here we see, if you have below median savings, you're typically betting almost twice as much relative to your income as those with kind of above median savings. We also see that these folks are more likely to be overdrawing, the kind of below median savings folks, kind of naturally. But there's also a bigger impact of legalization of betting on the likelihood of overdrafting as well. Okay, so all of that was just kind of summary statistics about bettors and non-bettors. What we want to do next is kind of exploit this staggered rollout of online sports betting across states in the US to try to identify kind of causal impacts of sports betting on downstream household financial outcomes. All right. So we have in our data, Nevada had legalized sports betting kind of before our sample even started. Our data, the first peak at our data is in 2010, so kind of labeled here, but Nevada is kind of always legal. But what happened in 2018 was New Jersey actually had a lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court about being able to engage in sports betting kind of over the wishes of like the federal government. And they won this case. And so they were the first new state to kind of legalize sports betting, followed quickly by West Virginia. And then the next year, the floodgates, were open. And so we had 7 new states, or 6 new states in 2019, a couple new states plus DC in 2020, and then another 10 or so, 12 or so over the next few years. There are a few more. This is just looking at those that legalized online sports betting. There were a few other states that legalized only on-premises sports betting, which is basically like you have to go to a particular state-run entity, like location, or to an existing casino with a sports book, and you can do sports betting there. And I'll talk about that maybe a little bit at the end. But suffice it to say, the magnitude of the effect that the in terms of just dollars being bet is almost 100% driven by those states that legalized online sports betting rather than on premises. So on premises just doesn't have the impact in take-up rates or in downstream financial effects that the online sports betting does. But this is the sort of thing that we're going to exploit. We're going to be looking at when these states kind of turn on the ability to legally gamble. I'll show you the first stage, which is kind of how that affects dollars being bet among these households, and then look at kind of impacts of legalization on other sorts of financial outcomes as well. This is the current state of things in 2023. So you can see that there's it's still a number of states with no legal betting. The most states that did legalized online and retail. There's just Tennessee legalized online only. There are a few states that legalized like retail only or on premises only. So basically, you have to go to a particular casino or a particular site physically that might have, might not be 24 hours a day. It might have other restrictions as well. But the blue states here, the states in blue are online, basically unrestricted online sports gambling. Right. So what are we going to do? I'm going to have two different empirical kind of identification strategies here. The first is just going to be a staggered difference in difference, where we're going to be looking at various things on the left-hand side here in terms of like quarterly spending or various types of consumption or investment. We're going to be regressing this on an interaction between whether that household lives in a treated state and is post-legalization. We're going to include lots of other time fixed effects, state fixed effects, person fixed effects. So that kind of takes out all of the non-interacted versions of these, as well as controlling for individual invariant effects on spending and income and investment, various seasonal effects, kind of national economic cycle from the time fixed effects will all be sucked out by the time fixed effects. And so we're going to be looking at the differential trend in, say, consumption or investment in particular states that legalize versus those that are not legal. And we can do this not just on average, but we can do this quarter by quarter. So we can have those coefficients interacted by quarters post legalization as well. And so we can plot kind of it's called like a distributed lag plot, where here this is just the first stage. This is basically what is the effect of legalization on dollars flowing to these sports books by households in our data. And you can see that we have a pretty good pre-trend here of essentially zero. So, there's often questions about whether people were circumventing the, sports betting being illegal or different things, at least in terms of like using a VPN, but still accessing some of these betting sites, it essentially is zero, right? There's, if you were betting through, some like crypto deposit to an Irish, gaming site or something like that, we can't observe, unfortunately. But if you were just using a VPN to say that you were in a different state or crossing borders or things like that, that basically doesn't happen. So there's essentially no betting of any appreciable amount in the pre-period through these sites or through kind of mobile sports betting. And then in the post period, in the quarter of legalization, you jump up to about $15 per person in the state, right? So this isn't just per bettor, that's per person in the state, $15 per person. So in a state like California, 30 million people, it's going to be $45 million in that initial quarter kind of deposited to these sites. Okay, and then we also have, $450 million. And then this just kind of ramps up from there. And so this trend within state is kind of driven by two factors. One is, like I said, intensive margin, where an individual who bets in the first quarter tends to keep betting. And so you often see increases in bets over time within a bettor. But actually the bigger effect is the extensive margin, where more and more people become aware of these sports betting sites through advertising. James and I were kind of talking before the seminar started that these ads are kind of ever present. Every show on ESPN now is like sponsored by it. Every game, every team, every arena has the official like partner for DraftKings or FanDuel or whatever. Like the Cubs, here in Chicago, the Cubs Stadium had a huge renovation with like the biggest addition was this giant DraftKings pavilion kind of sports betting thing. So there's just more and more people, a bigger and bigger fraction of the state tends to start betting, and bettors who are already betting bet more. And so after a few years here, we're up to about $60 per person in the state. And one thing we're interested in is kind of if we can update the data another couple of years, like where does this plateau? Does it ever plateau? We're still seeing increases in the aggregate data that gets reported to state regulators. And so these dollar amounts that are being bet kind of continue to go up, even out as some of these states have been legalized for 4 or 5 years now. We see continued growth. And so like all of the effects that we're going to show are kind of downstream of the aggregate dollars being lost here. And so if those top line numbers, that first stage keeps getting bigger, I think the other financial effects are going to keep growing as well. All right. This is just a regression version of that graph with like one coefficient. So kind of taking an average here, like putting one horizontal line and just allowing for a post period rather than this dynamic plot. But suffice to say, you see increases in sports bets over time, and you see that some of these increases are larger for people who are a little more constrained. So if you've been overdrafting, you typically see larger increases in sports betting, and especially for the lower income, like low savings or households that have overdrafted, they tend to be betting a lot more relative to their income than kind of the higher income or less constrained groups. Okay. All right. So the first kind of question, and again, going back to like how this is pitched by sports betting companies or these gaming companies, they say, this is basically coming out of people's entertainment budgets. You should think of this as entertainment spending. And so, if that is the case, and this just comes out of entertainment spending, then if you increase betting, there should be maybe no impact on consumption outside of entertainment. And entertainment spending should essentially be negative, right? Entertainment spending other than the deposits to sports bets should go down to kind of offset your increases in betting. What we're seeing here is a lot of positive coefficients, though. And so what to kind of explain this is basically just looking at the impact of sports betting legalization on spending across a few different categories. So restaurant spending, cable and telecom, that includes like streaming services as well as internet, TV packages and things like that, or cell packages, things like that. And then entertainment and travel expenses. And so like, going to bars, going to movies, going to concerts, going to shows, or going to sports games themselves are kind of all embedded in that entertainment category. Overall, we see that all of these kind of discretionary spending categories see increases. So not only are you spending more money to, eventually be lost in sports gambling, but we also see that there are kind of pretty sizable or effects of similar magnitudes kind of across several of these other discretionary categories. So increases in restaurant spending, increases in cable telecom streaming. You spring for the extra Premier League or extra NFL Sunday ticket, or the extra service to get all of those games maybe now, or you go out to bars more, you maybe go to more games that you're betting on. And so across the board, we see this increase in discretionary spending. And again, most of these are larger for kind of more constrained households as well. Okay, so the kind of effects on the spillover effects on non-sports betting discretionary spending are biggest for some of these constrained groups. One thing that we often got asked is, well, is this betting not substituting for other entertainment spending, but is it substituting for other sorts of gambling expenditures? And there we find kind of mixed things, but nothing that can offset the magnitude of increase in sports betting and other consumption. So we actually see that lottery spending on lotteries increases. So rather than being offset, again, this is like crowding in more sorts of risky or discretionary spending. Online poker, kind of no effect. Cryptocurrency is actually one place where we see a little bit of offsetting behavior. So as sports betting gets legalized, crypto deposits to crypto trading sites actually decrease. And so it's not big enough to offset the increase in other sorts of consumption or the sports betting in general. But we thought this was kind of interesting and kind of dovetails into our findings about investment. So in as much as people who are engaging in sports betting maybe think that sports betting is like investment, they might also think crypto is like investment as well. And so they kind of trade off between these three types of say risky behavior, where though maybe they have different expected values, right? But overall, yeah, changes in other sorts of at least betting that we can observe in does not offset the increase in sports betting that occurs. All right. So this is our kind of last state level result here. Just using this state level diff and diff, we find that net investment declines quite a bit after sports betting is legalized in a given state. So we see about $50 decline per quarter in net flows to investment companies after the legalization of sports betting in that state. Okay. Now, all of these results were just at a state level, and so we're just saying for everyone in the state, we're kind of turning on sports betting. It would be nice to get more of an elasticity to say, like, for a given person who is betting, $100 versus $1,000, like how much difference is there in the downstream consumption or investment decisions. Now, we can't just condition on how much somebody's betting directly, because that choice of how much to bet and whether to bet in general is endogenous to their financial circumstances and other preference that might also jointly drive their investment decisions or consumption decisions. And so, the nice thing about that state level diff and diff is it's kind of exogenous to the person, but we can't, as I say here, we can't identify the effect of a dollar of betting within person, and we can't control for within state time trends. So if there was we can control for national time trends and state fixed effects, but kind of if there was some different trend within the states that legalized versus not legalized, that could contaminate our effects. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to try to come up with something that is like a pre-existing characteristics of these households that is fairly invariant to their financial circumstances, that would affect how much they bet, or basically how treated they are by this legalization. And so what we're going to do is we're going to instrument for a proxy for being male or female, with the idea that men tend to bet a lot more. They are much more treated by the legalization of sports betting because they are typically the ones that are going to take up sports betting relative to women. And that this is something that was not endogenously determined by them based on their financial circumstances. And so this is going to allow us kind of to go within the state and say, for like men within the state versus women within the state, do their investment decisions or their consumption decisions start to diverge after the legalization of sports betting? Okay, so it gives us one additional dimension to kind of control for here. And unfortunately, like I said, we don't see demographics directly, but what we do see is all of this consumption data and the merchants that they go to. And so we can observe, who is mostly spending at places that are like beauty supply stores or fabric.com or things like that, as some of the more extreme kind of female-centric merchants, versus like a Cabela's outdoor store or getting Xbox Live subscriptions. Okay. And so this is going to allow us to identify those who are kind of most likely to be male versus most likely to be female. And then we could do a within state difference in difference here. And what do we find with that? Well, we can use this instrument to go and then construct an elasticity. So we can basically instrument for the amount that these individuals are betting based on kind of how male or female they seem. And then look at the impacts on investment and consumption. And then we can construct this elasticity measure, where we find about $1 of betting is almost perfectly offset by $1 less of net investment, right? But now remember, there are other sorts of increases in consumption as well as the increase in mobile sports betting. So the investment kind of offsets the betting, but there's still this increase in other sorts of consumption that is going on in the background that's still putting additional pressure on these households' budgets. Okay. We can also break down those investment effects into different types of destinations or types of brokerages, and so we can look in aggregate at the aggregate flows to net investment, and that's basically what these first three columns are. That's like kind of across all brokerages. But we can also look at particular types of brokerages, and this was something that some people had brought up to us in previous conference, like, is this just flowing out of other sorts of brokerages like Robinhood, that people are doing crazy sorts of bets on and like options trading on in general? Or is this coming out of, Vanguard and Fidelity and like traditional brokerage accounts? We do find that you can find effects across all of these different types of brokers. So Robinhood sees declines in net investments, but also like robo advisors that don't allow for any options trading. They only allow indexing. You also see outflows there. You see outflows from new brokers and online only brokers, or from long-standing existing brokers, Schwab and Merrill Lynch and Vanguard and things like that. So this is a pretty across the board decline in net investment behavior. All right, and again, these effects typically are larger for these more constrained households. Might be that they had kind of less room to maneuver, less average net savings, that they were going to be the ones that are forced to cut back more strongly than kind of richer households. Okay. So kind of the last main result here is kind of related to that fact that while the decline in investment seems to offset the increase in sports betting, there's still all that other sorts of discretionary expenditures that tend to increase as well post legalization. And so here we're seeing that that other consumption is basically leading there to be additional effects on household financial health. So things like increases in credit card debt, decreases in available credit, increases in overdrafting of checking accounts. So people are like running down their margins, they're levering up, they're running out of room on their credit cards as the longer that the legalization kind of persists here. Okay, so overall, there tend to be some kind of we've talked to a lot of legislatures that have been kind of considering the legalization of sports betting. And we try to make the point that like this is something that's very popular for most people. This is we stay pretty neutral in the paper about the extent to which this is bad or good. We're kind of documenting some outcomes, but certainly people really enjoy sports betting, and so the net utility gain or loss is maybe a little bit more up in the air. But in as much as a lot of states and the federal government try to incentivize people to kind of save more for retirement. If anything, Americans probably save too little for the long term, for retirement, for kind of other sorts of long-term savings, and maybe have a little bit too much credit card debt in equilibrium. This is kind of acting against some of those other things that we see. Okay. So yeah, I mean, those are essentially our main results. We find the legalization of sports betting does have far-reaching consequences for household financial health, and we think that those consequences are going to continue to kind of grow in magnitude as sports betting continues to expand across the country, both across states and within states, and even within existing bettors. We find that this induces rather than displaces other discretionary consumption expenses. So it is not just substituting for other entertainment endeavors, but it is definitely spreading kind of throughout budgets. It decreases net investment quite strongly, especially for more financially fragile households. And it has other kind of negative or kind of more vulnerable, making households more vulnerable in several ways through their balance sheet. So increasing credit card debt, reducing savings, reducing available credit, leading to more frequent overdrafts. We think that there are, like I said, trade-offs between the priorities of state legislatures. I mean, I had a kind of enlightening discussion with one person who was the sponsor of a bill in one state to legalize this, just saying that like, yes, that's all well and good that can be some negative effects, but 90% of my constituents want this to be legal, and that is a very compelling thing. And we can't say anything about that, but we should our results I think point to there being trade-offs for these legalizations, especially for that group of individuals that is the most heavy bettors. So that kind of upper tercile, upper quartile that are putting in really meaningful amounts of money relative to their income. For most people who are betting, 10 or $20 a quarter, this is not a huge deal, most likely. But there is a group of bettors where this is impactful. And I think that there are some things being discussed in the regulatory landscape that might help target some of the large bettors. Adding friction, so going from mobile, allowing online sports betting to on premises has dramatic effects on the extent to which the kind of extent of dollars that are being wagered. Potentially, like some other vices, you could have some limits on advertising, and potentially also some regulation to increase like bet pricing transparency. So I think there's some surveys that point to the fact that a lot of individuals don't really understand the margins that these companies are making, or the likelihood of like winning a given bet, and that if you are winning 54% of the time on kind of coin flip outcomes, you'd think that you'd be a big winner, but because of the spread, you are probably still losing money. And so that would be, I think, potentially useful as well for the people who are just maybe betting, or who are not as sophisticated of bettors. But I very much look forward to any questions you all might have. If you have any thoughts, happy to chat more. Feel free to reach out and email me or my co-authors. We're working on, I'd mentioned to James, we're working on some follow-up where we have kind of internal betting data from a couple of states where the regulators kind of mandated that these sports books make data available to researchers for kind of better understanding of what's going on. And so we're kind of working on that in a couple of states where we're trying to understand like what kind of triggers people or what drives people to engage in some of this, what looks like really compulsive behavior, and investigating like what gets people up into that upper decile or upper quartile of bets, and away from the kind of casual bettor into the serious bettor, where there are probably more effects on their financial health.
Thank you very much, Scott. I'm going to give you a team's round of applause. And it is, well, thank you for a really, really interesting talk, really relevant, really important as well. I think a really interesting, I guess interesting is maybe the word, I don't know, but experiment, if you like, in terms of something being illegal and then being legalized, giving you that clearer distinction than is probably the case in many other places. So thank you very much for that. We've got plenty of time for questions and comments. So if anyone has a question or a comment, please do raise your hand.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. I mean, we haven't looked as much at kind of, this has been an entirely U.S. specific kind of paper, and we didn't have a lot of experience like knowing about, we hadn't written about sports betting before, but the extent to which some of these things have come up in lots of other countries is like the UK and others have kind of a longer standing history of sports betting. I don't know, and some of you folks might know a lot more about if some of the same things have been looked at elsewhere.
I'd say there's few people with a better knowledge of sports betting than David Forrest, and he's got his hand up. So go on, David.
Well, I thought I'd better put my hand up because of the lack of other questions. Perhaps others will speak after me. You're quite right in what you just said, which is there are a great many similarities in what you found compared with what we observe in Europe. For example, the very skewed distribution of spending on betting. For betting and gambling more general, the skew is fantastically great. The distribution of spending in Great Britain, which I estimated from a study of 140,000 online accounts from 7 operators, it was definitely hyper Pareto. 90% of the the operator win coming from 10% of the customers. So that much is very familiar. A couple of other scattered comments. One is I'm interested in how you view the illegal sector. I know that there are still some large states like California which have not legalized, but a high proportion of Americans now have access to legal sports betting. And nevertheless, and I know this comes from not an independent source, report this week that the betting on Super Bowl, 65% of the spending on Super Bowl betting was alleged to be in the illegal sector. And what do I mean by the illegal sector? Well, it can be a lot of different things, but we know that from before legalization, the US, along with China, was the biggest betting market in the world, and the bulk of the spending was through offshore hubs in the Caribbean, which managed to supply American bettors with betting services, mainly through the use of agents, because there is blocking of banking transfers to offshore sites in the US. So to the extent that the money was reaching the offshore sites, it wouldn't be observed in your pre-legalization data. That in a way strengthens your findings, because you're only observing part of the increase in a lot of the old market is still not there. So a lot of people, as with cannabis legalization, they won't have bothered switching to the legal because they were getting a good deal already. So it's possible that you were picking up new bettors disproportionately, because maybe the illegal bettors are still in Antigua and so on. Let me assure you, by the way, because of your throwaway remark, that the Republic of Ireland is not one of these hubs for illegal gambling.
I guess I've heard more about prediction markets, and that's where a lot of them are all based. But maybe not all the sports books. But no, not illegal, just legal and just offshore. But yeah, so we can observe. Yeah, I'll be more clear on like what we can and can't observe and kind of threats to identification. So there's several ways where you can be betting kind of illegally in the pre-period. There's betting on Super Bowl squares with your friends, or betting in cash, like $20 against your friends on the game on the weekend. There's going to there's kind of quasi-legal but not measured by us, which would be like going across a border to a casino or to a sports book in a neighboring state. So we would observe that, and we would see that that's where like that pre-trend at basically zero would help. There's also like if you were using a VPN or some other sorts of means to bet through one of these states from a not legal state to a legal state, again, that is also helped by that existence of like the zero pre-trend. I think what you're bringing up is kind of the ultra sophisticated, serious people. If they were doing some sort of getting money to a bank in the Caribbean through some kind of financial transfer and then betting there, we would not be able to observe that in the pre or the post period as a betting expense. But you're right. I think it kind of works against us. And so, it attenuates our results, because to the extent that people were shifting from legal or illegal to legal betting, then that would basically mean that there shouldn't be any effects on consumption that we observe. Or if they were just continuing to bet illegally, then they're kind of just not in the sample, at all. But I think you're right that the majority of these people, just by number, are going to be new bettors who have not really done any sort of systematic sports betting in the past. I agree that there are definitely some people who are who are betting in the pre-period through some means, but just in terms of the volume of dollars and the volume of people that start engaging in sports betting in the post-period, I think it is orders of magnitude bigger. So I agree, we are missing some stuff, but I think just in terms of like the raw dollars being bet, it is just the first stage is still very much there and very strong, and I think we are capturing probably most of it.
A couple of other points, if I may.
Please, yeah.
One is that on one of the slides you had the proportion of betting deposits relative to income.
Yeah.
And that's a variable that worries me.
Okay.
Because we know from a universal finding of studies on income elasticity demand for betting that pretty much all income classes spend the same amount in absolute terms on betting. So that when you observe the variation across households in betting deposits divided by income, the variation is coming from the income rather
That's right.
than
The vast majority of it is coming from the income. That's right. Yes.
So I wonder whether you should have income, perhaps in addition to B over Y.
Sure. So are you saying as an outcome, or just to like better describe that?
If you will look,
I agree that the lower income folks are, if anything, betting a little bit less than higher income folks. But it's just their income is much lower.
I mean, I'm thinking of a very well known, but in my view, flawed paper for Great Britain using financial transaction data. You probably know it, using Lloyds Bank data. There are all sorts of outcomes, such as mortality and illness, but also pretty judgmental things like gym membership, which is alleged to be implied it's a good thing.
Yeah.
And that when you bet, you're not doing this very good thing of going to the gym.
I see.
But every time they're finding that deposits over income is predicting what they regard as a bad outcome. But then if you've got very low income elasticity, there's going to be more variation in the denominator than in the numerator.
Yeah,
so
very
that's
much
something
so.
I'm always alert to.
Sure. Yeah, so we let me be clear. Like, we never use that as a right-hand side variable directly. That was kind of just a summary stat, and just saying that, like, I mean, as you say, I mean, it's a well-known fact maybe that these folks, lower income individuals in general, are kind of more exposed to this, just in terms of like potential budgetary pressure, because they are, this represents a bigger chunk of their budget or a bigger chunk of their income. So it was kind of going in the direction of like stylized fact and motivation, rather than, we're not trying to say that ratio is necessarily driving this, but just mechanically, they might be more exposed because of that.
I mean, I'll make the last point because maybe people will have thought up questions. One thing you probably don't know, because not many British people know, is that in this country, the online slots industry is much bigger than the online betting industry. Fewer participants, but on average they spend much more. And what we've found in looking at account data is that there's a big difference in where the money is coming from between betting on the one hand and casino and slots games on the other. Betting is pretty classless. So when we have in Britain official government ranking of very micro neighbourhoods as to how deprived they are, and we divided all the neighbourhoods by postcode into 10 deciles, and we found that the proportion of spending total receipts by the betting industry across for each decile was almost exactly 10%. Absolutely no difference between deprived and non-deprived neighborhoods. Whereas we were finding for gaming online that there was a very remarkable concentration of spending in the most deprived areas where you'd expect the vulnerable households to be. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is that I know that some of the US states simultaneously legalized iGaming along with sports betting, I think predominantly in the Northeast. And maybe there aren't enough states for you to be able to do anything, but can you distinguish, for example, if money goes, does it go to the same DraftKings merchant?
Exactly. No, this is a great point. And right now we don't distinguish. You're right. For some of these, we can't distinguish. It goes to the same portal and the transaction looks identical. For some of the sports books, there's like a sports book and there's a casino, and they actually look, the transaction appears differently. So we could break that out. Right now, we kind of treated them the same, but that is something that we could break out. And you're right. I mean, even in the U.S., like I think existing table games. So there's lots of different state regulations about slots and table games and other things like that. And that industry is still bigger than sports betting, but sports betting is kind of quickly, it was essentially zero, or it was maybe 5% the size or 2% the size of the table games and slots, and now it's about 25-30% the size and kind of growing. So I don't know if it'll overtake it, but it does seem like it is, a massive increase. And it seems like the sports betting component has taken off to a larger extent in those states that legalize both online casino games and online sports betting. It seems like online sports betting is making up a bigger share of those new dollars, for better or for worse. But I think that's something that we could focus on a little bit more. Right now, we kind of haven't delved into that at all. Thank you, though. Super helpful.
Thanks, David. And then we've got Ian with his hand up.
Hello, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I just wanted to ask you about, do you at all look at the difference between legalizing online sports betting versus land-based sports betting? Because I noticed that your variable, you just look at online sports betting.
So the main results are all with just online sports betting legalization. So there were a few states that legalized just the on premises or kind of some variant thereof, and those effects are just much smaller. So the first stage is just much lower. So by the first stage, I mean the effects on the increase in dollars being bet are much lower. And we can observe those as well. We can see when people kind of go to the casino or spend at the sports book or things like that. Or some of them say that you have to be on this premises, and then once you're geolocated there, like you can use your phone to bet. And the amount of dollars being bet there is a small fraction of the states that fully legalized online mobile sports betting. And the kind of downstream financial effects are much lower as well. So you're right. We talk about it a little bit in the paper, not really in the presentation, but this is actually consistent with some other papers that have come out recently that looked at kind of other sorts of outcomes based on legalization. So there's one paper with credit bureau data that looked at like delinquencies and bankruptcies and things like that.
Okay.
And they find essentially no effect, or at least not distinguishable from zero effects in states that legalize just on premises, and big effects on states that do mobile. So I think that like adding that friction, needing to go somewhere in person, is very, very powerful, and just means that people are not going to be doing it very much. Now, on the flip side, like if people really enjoy and get a lot of utility out of sports betting, like that kills a lot of maybe people's enjoyment as well. But it does make just the overall impact of legalization a order of magnitude smaller, let's say.
But would you be able to observe it if, say, they used cash to pay at these premises?
So if they use cash, we cannot observe it very well. We could try to, some of the ATM withdrawals are sometimes like geolocated or are listed as like ATM at, Caesar's Casino or something like that, which we could try to do some imputations. But there we can still see the knock-on effects on consumption, or the lack of knock-on effects on consumption, right? Or investments and things like that. And so if we look at not just sports betting, even if we say we can't observe that very well, we can still see the other like left-hand side variables that we were looking at with the same degree of fidelity as in other states, and we just don't see the effects there. So either they're much more successful when they're on premises and they don't actually lose that much money, or they're just not betting as much. And I think it's probably the latter.
Okay, thank you very much.
No, my pleasure.
Great, thanks, Ian. Any more questions and comments? I think Jorge was there a split second ahead of Raphael. So Jorge, go ahead.
Hi. Question, I guess, for Scott and maybe for David, because here in Colombia, and you talked about some subsidies they gave during the pandemic to household for the kids and stuff, and I think you cannot see it in your data set. But here in Colombia, and I guess in Latin America, we are having this problem for a long time, that subsidies to vulnerable households tend to go to some kind of gaming or betting and stuff, and of course sport betting. And I'm wondering if there is some kind of way to check this in the US or maybe in Europe or England, about whether you have this problem, because it is an issue. There is, this. I don't know if any real good papers talking about that, but that a bunch of money that the governments give to households in form of subsidies go to some kind of betting.
Yeah. So this sort of I've actually used this sort of data to look at the consumption impacts of some of the stimulus checks that were received in the U.S. So back during the pandemic, we were able to very quickly, using this data that could be updated every day, and see with a lot of fidelity. You can directly observe those checks, hitting people's bank accounts, and then you can see what happens to consumption. We didn't see a lot of. There was some money that went to like crypto investing or betting or things like that. Most of it did not. So like certainly for some people they probably did that, but at least in terms of like people getting these checks and the next day putting it into the betting site, that wasn't. On average, that wasn't a really widespread phenomenon. I haven't
because down here they decide with much of these aid subsidies, they at some point, and there were good studies on this, they decide to pay a woman as head of the household instead of a man.
Yeah,
because
I know.
They're more serious.
Yeah, I recall some of that, similar things in a couple African countries about aid being passed down and like not going to alcohol, so they gave it to they wanted it to go to the child, and so they gave it to the mother, not the father, things like that. And I know, Brazil has also been having a lot of issues, I think, with some of this online sports betting as well. I've talked to some researchers researchers there, and they didn't pitch in quite the same way, but I think it has really taken off and caused some issues that for kind of lower income households. So I haven't seen it as like a direct, like, the next day after you get the stimulus check, you go deposit it all into DraftKings, but that was probably some of the impact was coming through, the extent to which some of these lower income households had maybe more liquidity than they otherwise would have during the pandemic, because of this massive fiscal stimulus. But we see it pretty widespread. I was just in last week or the week before, I was at West Point, like the U.S. Army Military Academy, talking about this because they've been, having issues with like all of their cadets, spending all this time, not just the monetary issues, but also like the attention in class and things like that, having, problems with all of these young men basically spending lots of time and attention and money thinking about sports betting, to try to figure out what to do. So it seems like a widespread potential issue, at least.
Great. Thanks, Jorge. Raphael is on up next.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Scott. Well, thank you very much for your interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. I think it could be interesting when you could show that legalization led to more increases in problem gambling. So I was thinking about maybe you could construct some outcome variables that is based on some escalation in the sizes of the deposit for the individual persons. So did you look at that, or do you see a kind of that some people kind of escalate their deposits? So that
we've been looking at this a little bit here. We're mostly saving that for this next paper that we're writing, where we have the actual like internal betting data. So right now we see that the flows from between the bank accounts and the betting sites, we don't see inside the betting sites. So it's kind of a black box, and this new data kind of cracks open the black box and says we have all of the bets, all of the behavior, as well as the deposits that we can link to. And so there, I think we really want to get into, for a lot of these people who, like David was saying, are probably new bettors, they haven't really done a lot of this before, like what drives people potentially to really scale up and maybe enter that like problem gambler group. Is it that they had a lot of success with early bets? Is it that they didn't have success with early bets and that they followed up? And so I think trying to dig into that, and we need to read a bit more of there's lots of papers on compulsive behavior and addiction and things like that in different, not just in gambling, but in like alcohol and in other things that we want to kind of relate to. So I think that's like a natural next place to go, because it especially because it gets a little more at some of the more explicitly at the utility trade-off, right? Because our paper, like I said, we try to stay pretty neutral in the sense that like this is a very popular thing. People get a lot of joy out of it. There's financial trade-offs, I think, but those financial trade-offs are probably most acute for the people who really get onto that far out in that distribution, as you say. And so if you can maybe help that top 5%, 10% of people who are not having fun anymore but are doing it compulsively and really having bad effects on their finances, that seems like the biggest win, the biggest policy win or utility win in general. Now, whether the gambling sites can stay in business without those people's business, I guess is another question. But we'll see what we can see.
Maybe can I add something, just a comment?
Please, please.
So one issue with online betting is that those betting operators, they know the whole transaction history of the customers, right? So this was less the case in retail betting. So their algorithms can basically determine whether you are a losing customer, like a good customer for them, or a winning customer. So they can actually specifically target ads to you, right? So they can, if they know that you are a losing customer, they can offer you free bets that others don't get. They can offer you more ads, and maybe this asymmetry in the ads that only a few people get, maybe it's the households with low incomes, right? Could also explain some of your results, but also could explain that especially those households get in trouble, right? So yeah, just as a comment.
Yeah, definitely the kind of bad bettors, are allowed to kind of increase volume to a larger extent. I think that's one of the big levers that gets pulled, especially in the other direction. And you hear lots of kind of sophisticated bettors complaining about it, that people who are, have 10 different accounts and bet 7 figures just arbitraging, like, odds and things like that, they start to get detected and shut down. And they'll have their bets limited by the sports books and say, you can't bet $1,000 on this position, you can only bet $50 to kind of try to remove the profitability. And you actually hear them. You hear stories of some of the sophisticated gamblers trying to look like unsophisticated gamblers to try to trick the betting sites into like not closing their account. So they'll do things like log on at 3 a.m. or log on a bunch of times in a row to try to look like they're compulsively doing it, but they'll actually just be trying to, so it's kind of some gamesmanship. But that's one thing that's been put forward in terms of potential regulation is whether everyone has to get treated the same, or whether the sports books can kind of tailor stuff to good or bad bets for them. So I think that's really interesting. When we see the internal data, we can't see the ads that get shown. We can see the promotions that get adopted, that get taken up. I don't know if we can see the promotions that get offered. I'll have to double check. That might depend on which, but I think we can only observe like what actually gets utilized. But we can see every bet and whether it had a promotion attached to it or not, and the odds and everything else. So I think we'll be able to at least get some ways into that.
Thanks.
Thanks, Raphael. I think David might have been wanting to respond to Jorge's point. So David, go ahead.
Oh yeah, please. I think you're muted, David.
Yes, James, you're right. I'm responding primarily to a question from Jorge. It was mentioned whether people who receive welfare benefits go out and spend it on gambling. There's only one paper explicitly on this that I know of, which is from Israel, and it doesn't observe individuals, but it observes state monopolists, retail premises, and the sort of neighborhoods they were in, and what proportion of income in that area comes from Social Security payments. And it finds a statistically significant uplift on Social Security days. But although statistically significant, it's economically trivial. It's systematic, but a very small proportion. And perhaps that's surprising because payday does tend to have a strong effect. I mean, employee payday. I've got a paper under review at the moment with Finnish colleagues, and we've got the state monopolists account data. And for most of the male customers who are, as Scott said, there's a very high proportion of the bettors are males. For the male customers, because Finland's next door to Russia, they do time in the army. And so we've got personality tests and IQ test results on each of the bettors. And we find that there is an uplift quite significant on payday of the amount bet. And it tends to be smaller for people who have higher IQ, high conscientiousness as a big 5 personality trait, and higher income. Though some effect is found for all those in case of all those variables, really until the very top of the distribution, it's only the very rich who don't seem to go and have a bit of an extra amount spent on payday. If you were looking for problem gamblers, I would look at cases in account data where there is the uplift on payday, but in the days up to payday, there's a slump in the amount of betting, because that will indicate that the person likes betting, but has run out of money and then has a splurge. And in fact, I'm currently involved as an expert witness in an inquest involving just such a pattern. I'm going to get in one more comment if Scott doesn't mind, in case.
Please, yeah, I was going to ask you a question, David. After that, yeah.
If he, in case he might want to follow this up in the text of the paper, because you gave some emphasis to the fact that it seemed that it was a rising trend, that once people started, it was a bit of a snowball effect. But it was quite a limited period that you were able to observe.
Yes.
But in the gambling literature, although it's not popular with the public health people, there are quite a few papers on what's called the adaptation hypothesis, which is, it's taken from biology really, that killer viruses, first of all, kill a lot of people. But after a while, even though the viruses are still around, somehow society or immune systems adapt. Now, there's supposed to be evidence for this in the case of gambling. I found some in the study in Macau, that when a new form of gambling is introduced, like casinos, you get an increase in the problem gambling rate. But after 3 or 4 years, it turns down and goes back to its original level, because somehow either individuals or the society figures out safeguards to avoid excessive play. So that's a literature you might reference.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I mean, and we certainly, there's the old saying, like, if something can't keep going on forever, then it will stop. And so, this will stop at, it can't increase forever. It's like a fraction of, budgets. And so whether it plateaus at some level, like it hasn't happened yet, whether it plateaus or whether it decreases and is kind of hump shaped, it goes back to a lower level. I think you're absolutely right that, I could see there being offsetting impacts being driven by something like, increases in regulation or, scaling back the level of legalization or something like that. Absolutely, point well taken. We were describing like the current upward trend, but obviously, we will look in the future to see where that continues. If it continues, stops, decreases, it can't continue forever, but where we'll stack
by the
up.
way, most companies, multinational companies who entered the American market, are finding the results very disappointing. And it's because they're obtaining revenue growth, but at considerable expense in terms of bonuses. They're having to give more bonuses to sustain the market than they do in Europe.
I mean, it seems like it's been a big kind of gold rush for a big scramble for customers, and there's starting to be a lot more consolidation. So I assume it's going to end up being, a couple big players that control most of it. And you're exactly right. Like how sticky those bonuses make people versus if they're just, ephemeral, I think is a great question. So we'll see. Yeah, we're definitely looking forward to getting the updated data, at least getting a couple more years. But maybe in the next 5 it will become more apparent. I was going to ask you before we go. I was going to ask you a question of for thinking ahead to some future stuff on identifying more of the problem gamblers. Is there anything that you'd look for in terms of you were doing some of this? I think it was a great suggestion. Looking at deposits on payday and things like that. But kind of given the granularity of data that we could potentially bring to this in terms of transactions, are there any sorts of like transactions or other merchants or behavior either on the consumption side, income side, betting side, that would be a great indicator of being a compulsive or problem gambler versus a heavy gambler.
Well, there's a huge literature.
Yeah.
Partly because in nearly all European countries, the license conditions require online operators to intervene in the case of problem gambling. So there's quite a big industry in designing algorithms which pick out patterns of behavior. And there's an American literature as well, and Rachel Valberg, whom you quote at the top of your paper, has written a lot on it. They tend to use self-exclusion as a proxy for problem gambling, but there are consistent results across all the papers, and it's not all about volume. High volume people are at greater risk, but there's also patterns, and there's something an American paper called a sawtooth pattern, which somehow relates to my payday work, that many problem gamblers are marked by periods of abstention followed by rapid escalation. Of course, the abstention might be maybe they're trying to give up, or maybe they've run out of money. But you predict problem gambling from a sawtooth pattern. Another very strong indicator is the number of gambling activities. There's not many problem gamblers who just gamble on one type of gambling. So if you found you can't observe it as easily in the financial data, but if you pick out, you've got gamblers as your variable, haven't you? Because you observe poker and so on.
Yeah.
But if individuals are gambling on multiple activities, that considerably raises the chances that they're a problem gambler. And I mean, I've said in another court case in which I was involved that to follow the British legislation, the operators should be intervening in about 10% of online gamblers, because the regulation here says that there must be operator intervention if there's a suspicion that either the customer is a problem gambler or at risk of becoming a problem gambler. And online, about 10% are either problem gamblers or at-risk gamblers.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
Right. Well, thank you, Scott. Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for your contributions. We have reached the end of our time. So thank you, everyone. It's been a great pleasure. I wish you all the best with your research and your ongoing work.
Thanks so much, James. Yeah.
And next week, we'll return. We'll have Tazio Panzani from the University of Perugia, and he'll be presenting work on Italian stadium demand with the title yet to be confirmed. But wish you all a great weekend and look forward to seeing you all again this time next week. Thanks very much.
Bye.